Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, where we dig into the connection between creativity and mental illness. We often think of geniuses as these untouchable figures, right? But what if their struggles, their inner demons, are actually the fuel for their brilliance? Today we're going deep into the life of Jorge Luis Borges, a literary giant who wrestled with blindness.
And what's fascinating about Borges is he wasn't just afraid of the dark, he was terrified of mirrors.
Really?
Yeah, think about that. A writer obsessed with reflections, with duality, with the nature of reality, and yet he was scared of his own reflection.
That's pretty wild. So this wasn't just some random phobia, it was connected to something deeper.
Oh, absolutely. Blindness was a family inheritance for Borges. His father lost his sight, as did his grandmother. And if you go even further back, you find this interesting paradox. The Borges family had a long military tradition. We're talking conquistadors, freedom fighters.
So on one hand, you have this legacy of courage, of action,
Hmm.
and on the other, this encroaching blindness threatening to take it all away.
Exactly. And it gets even more complex when you consider Borges's father, despite his failing eyesight, was a lawyer and a writer himself. He really nurtured Jorge Luis's love for books, immersing him in literature from a very young age.
What kind of stuff was he reading?
We're talking English classics, adventure stories, think Treasure Island, The New Arabian Nights, that kind of thing.
Makes you wonder if those stories, those escapes, were preparing him for a life lived more and more in his imagination.
That's a great point. And even as a child, Borges knew about his family history, knew he might go blind too. This awareness, along with his fear of mirrors, suggests a deep anxiety about self-image, this fear of losing himself, fragmenting. And that maybe brings us to one of the biggest themes in his work, the double.
Okay, so let's talk about this double concept. How does that play out in his writing? How is it connected to his blindness?
Well, think about it. What happens when you lose your sight? The world starts to disappear. But what takes its place? Your inner world, memory, imagination, and maybe even a sense of being divided. A self in the world of sight and a self in darkness.
So not just a physical duality, but a psychological one too.
Exactly. And in his stories, we see this reflected in characters who are split, mirrored, trapped in these mental labyrinths.
Right, those labyrinths are a big part of his work.
Exactly. And those labyrinths, the mirrors, the doubles, they become metaphors for the human mind. A mind that's constantly creating, reflecting, reinterpreting reality. And for Borges, that process was probably even stronger because of his failing eyesight.
Now, Borges' blindness wasn't sudden. It was gradual, right? And he knew it was coming. But there was this one event, a traumatic incident in 1938, that seemed to be a catalyst.
You're talking about the accident when he was 39. He suffered a severe head injury, almost died. What's interesting is that after this trauma, Borges had a burst of creative energy, especially in his short stories.
So it's like this near-death experience woke him up, forced him to face his own mortality.
Yeah, and in a way, it made him embrace the darkness that had been looming over him.
And maybe by embracing that darkness, he found a new light. A light that allowed him to see the world in a way he couldn't with his physical eyes.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this family legacy of blindness, this fear of mirrors and fragmentation, and then this traumatic accident that seems to spark his creativity. But how do these things actually show up in his writing?
That's where we really see the link between his life and his work. Borges' writing is obsessed with time, memory, infinity, the nature of reality. And you could argue these themes are even more powerful when you think about them through the lens of fading sight.
There's actually a quote from Borges about his childhood that comes to mind. He talks about growing up in a garden behind a speared railing and in a library of unlimited English books.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It's almost like foreshadowing the physical confinement of the garden versus the limitless world of the imagination.
That's a beautiful image. And it really speaks to the duality that runs through Borges' life and work. What's seen and unseen, the real and the imagined, the limits of the body and the limitless potential of the mind. And maybe it was in that tension, in that space between darkness and light, that Borges' genius truly took flight.
Yeah, I think we've laid some good groundwork here for understanding the connection between Borges' blindness and his creative output, but there's still a lot more to explore. All right, so we've talked about how Borges' blindness wasn't just a physical thing, it was like a theme throughout his life and his work. But let's get specific now. What are some examples in his writing where we see that connection between darkness and creativity?
Well, one really powerful example is his short story, The Circular Ruins. It's about this sorcerer who wants to dream a man into existence.
Okay.
He spends years crafting this being, thought by thought, detail by detail, until his creation feels real.
Yeah.
But then there's this twist, this realization that the sorcerer himself is also somebody else's dream.
Whoa, that's like a literary hall of mirrors, isn't it?
Yeah.
It goes right back to that fear of fragmentation, of losing yourself in the reflections.
Exactly. And it also touches on the limits of what we can perceive, the idea that what we think is real could just be another level of a dream. This theme really resonates with Borges's own experience, with the world slowly fading from view, the lines blurring between what's real and what's imagined.
It's like he's saying, if reality can be questioned, then why can't we create our own realities through imagination?
Right. And that leads us to another key element of Borges' style, the labyrinth. In stories like The Garden of Forking Paths or The Library of Babel, he uses labyrinths as metaphors for the human mind, all the possibilities of thought and memory. And for someone losing their sight, being able to navigate those mental labyrinths becomes so important.
It's interesting to think that those labyrinths could have been a coping mechanism. As his physical world was shrinking, his internal world was expanding, becoming more complex.
Absolutely, and that's where his use of language is so important. Even as his vision was getting worse, his command of language, his ability to create vivid images and ideas with such precision, it only seemed to get better.
It's like he was making up for the loss of one sense by making another one stronger. And that mastery of language allowed him to build these intricate worlds that readers can get lost in.
Yeah, and they do get lost. Borges's stories are full of dead ends, twists, and unexpected things. They really challenge how we think about time and space.
Yeah.
They make us confront the limits of our own perception. It's an experience that can be both exciting and unsettling, much like navigating the world with fading sight.
Okay, so we've got the double, the labyrinth, and his mastery of language. But there's another theme in his work that I think relates to his blindness, memory.
Absolutely. As Borges lost his vision, he had to rely more and more on memory. It became his main source of visual imagery, his connection to the world he could no longer fully see. And this focus on memory shows up in his writing in really fascinating ways.
Right, like in Fion's The Memorious, there's a character who can remember everything, every single detail, every sensation.
Right.
But this gift, it's actually a curse. Fionn gets overwhelmed by how much he remembers. He can't filter or categorize anything.
Yeah, it's a powerful exploration of how memory can be both a blessing and a burden. It shapes who we are, but it can also trap us in the past.
And for Borges, who is losing access to the present, to the physical world, that struggle with memory must have been really tough.
For sure. And it's not just in fumes. Throughout his work, Borges explores how subjective memory is, how it can change and be unreliable. He even questions if there's such a thing as a fixed past. He suggests that memory is fluid, always changing.
It's like he's saying, if we can't even trust our own memories, how can we really know ourselves or the world around us? And that feeling of uncertainty, of questioning reality, it really resonates with people, even those who haven't experienced vision loss.
Totally. It taps into this universal anxiety, this fear of losing ourselves, of losing our grip on what's real. Borges' blindness becomes a metaphor for that struggle.
So we've explored some of the key themes and techniques that connect Borges' blindness to his writing. But his life wasn't just books and ideas, right? He lived through some pretty intense times in Argentina.
Oh, absolutely. And those historical events, the political and social upheaval, they definitely impacted his work too.
So we've been digging into how Jorge Luis Borges' blindness wasn't just a physical condition, but a way of seeing the world that shaped his writing.
Yeah.
But there was more to his life than just books and labyrinths, right? He also lived through some really turbulent times in Argentina.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Borges was actually a pretty vocal critic of Juan Perón, whose populist regime came to power in 1946.
Right, Perón.
Borges saw his policies as authoritarian, really bad for Argentine culture, so he basically got blacklisted.
Wow, imagine that.
Huh.
A man who championed Argentine literature, suddenly labeled an enemy of the state.
It was a huge blow. Borges was removed from his librarian job. His writing was censored. He had to find new ways to survive, even writing detective stories under a fake name.
That's kind of ironic, isn't it? Borges, the master of complex philosophical stories, writing pulp fiction just to get by.
It is, and it shows how adaptable he was as a writer. But those detective stories, even though they're not his most famous works, they still play with that theme of reality versus fiction, something that was so central to his experience of losing his sight.
Yeah, it's like those shifting realities both in his fiction and his own life under Perón mirrored the uncertainty he felt from his fading vision. But even with all the political chaos, his work was starting to get recognized internationally.
It's amazing how his writing was taking off globally while he was being shut out in his own country. It
Right.
shows how universal his themes are: time, memory, identity. They speak to people everywhere.
Then in the 1970s, Argentina went through this really dark period, the Dirty War, a brutal dictatorship with all these human rights violations. How did Borges, who was already in his 70s then, handle all that?
Well, despite his age and his health, Borges continued to be an outspoken critic of the regime. He spoke out against the violence and disappearances, using his growing international platform to shine a light on what was happening.
It's like he was drawing on that family history of fighting for freedom, but this time his weapon was his pen. His blindness, something that could have been seen as a weakness, actually made his voice stronger. It made him a symbol of resistance, of intellectual defiance.
That's a really powerful way to put it. And it's important to remember that even as he condemned the regime, Borges didn't stop exploring the complexities of human nature in his writing. He never simplified things or offered easy moral judgments.
He got that we all have darkness inside us. And understanding that, understanding our capacity for both good and evil, was crucial for him. But in the midst of all this, he was also facing his own mortality.
As he got into his 80s, his health declined even more. His blindness was total by then.
Right.
But his mind, it was as sharp as ever. And he kept writing, producing some of his most profound works in those later years.
Works like The Book of Sand and Shakespeare's Memory. They really deal with loss, the fleeting nature of time, and trying to find meaning in a world that can feel chaotic and absurd. It's like he was trying to distill a lifetime of thinking and experience, knowing he didn't have much time left.
And he did it beautifully. His language in those late works, it's so direct, almost mystical. He's wrestling with the big questions. What does it mean to be human? What happens after we die?
Yeah, and he invites us to wrestle with those questions too, to accept the mystery, the uncertainty, and to find beauty in the unknown. I think ultimately Borges' life and work show us that limitations can be strengths, that darkness can illuminate as much as it hides.
Absolutely. His legacy is one of resilience, curiosity, and this unwavering belief in the power of literature. He reminds us that even in a world obsessed with visuals, words still have immense power to move us, challenge us, and inspire us.
So to our listeners, we really encourage you, check out Borges' work. Explore his labyrinths, his reflections, his thoughts on time and memory. You might be surprised what you find in his darkness. There's a light in there that can help us understand what it means to be human.
Couldn't said it better myself. That's maybe the greatest gift a writer can give. To challenge how we see things, make our imaginations bigger, and leave us with more questions than answers. Borges did all that, and then some.
And on that note, we wrap up our deep dive into the amazing life and work of Jorge Luis Borges. We hope this has made you curious and inspired you to discover the magic in his words.